Howdy everyone, and welcome to the Serial Geek TV YouTube channel. My name is James Eatock, and today we're going to take a look at the creation through many illustrations of the BraveStarr villain Tex Hex. Tex Hex. Arguably one of the most underrated villains of the 1980s. A villain with not only a fascinating backstory, an actual love interest from his past, and in possession of an array of devilish powers, but also one of the most detailed and visually striking bad guys we saw during that decade. Although Tex Hex may be somewhat forgotten by pop culture, those that created the character and developed him realised his worth from an incredibly early stage. The origin of Tex Hex's creation dates back to the development of Filmation's Ghostbusters series. The main antagonist in that series was a spectre by the name of Prime Evil, who surrounded himself with a plethora of frankly gorgeously designed ghouls and ghoulettes. Personally, I think that the villains in Ghostbusters were some of Filmation's most striking designs. I mean, just look at this lineup of weird and wonderful characters. When looking at the villains, we can see that many of them are themed. Haunter is your stereotypical aristocratic British hunter, see classic comedic actor Terry Thomas. Sir Trancelot is a knight, actually a former knight of the legendary Round Table. Fangster, a futuristic werewolf who was initially conceived as a gangster werewolf, hence the name. Long John Scarecrow, a pirate, so you can see that their ghostly gimmicks were strong. Well, one of the gimmicks created for a henchman was that of an outlaw from the Wild West. So intriguing was the concept illustration that Lou Scheimer had the character held back, basically taken away from the production of Ghostbusters, and approached Arthur Nadel to, at some point, develop a series around that character. Thus, the very first seed of production on a new animated series, which would become BraveStarr, had been planted. It's crazy when you think about it, a series primarily designed around the look of a villain. And in a bizarre way, if Columbia Pictures hadn't made their Ghostbusters movie, which prompted Filmation to turn their previous live-action Ghostbusters into an animated series, then Tex Hex, and by extension BraveStarr, would not have come to be. Well, suffice to say that BraveStarr was successfully developed into a series, and Tex Hex was a standout character in that series, having numerous episodes penned around him as a rather complex character. For a real fantastic look into Tex Hex, be sure to check out Eye of the Beholder, written by Tom Tatarynowitz, and Tex's Terrible Night, an episode which features some frankly wonderful animation directed by, you guessed it, Tom Tatarynowitz. So I was prompted to make this video after appearing in an episode of Fans of Power, in which my partner in crime, Dusan Mitrovic, the evil wizard, showcased some of these illustrations that he and I had uncovered a few years back. There's a lot of wonderful material here, and as melodramatic as this may sound, it really does showcase the amount of work and talent that goes into creating a single character for animation. Also, before I continue with this video, I just want to give a huge shout out to Charlie Adler, a prominent voice actor, probably best known for his roles as Buster Bunny on Tiny Toon Adventures and Cow and Chicken on, well, Cow and Chicken. He did a remarkable job with regards to voicing Tex Hex, perfectly emphasising the manic menace of the greed-driven villain with a slow, threatening voice.
I'm starting to get real annoyed with you, Marshal BraveStarr.
Coupled with moments of shrill, unbridled rage.
Destroy everything!
Now let's take a look at the visual development of Tex Hex, as well as speculating what some of these illustrations could represent. This is what we believe to be one of the first, if not the first, fully realised image of Tex Hex. The series Bible describes him as follows. Tex Hex is the lean, skeletal outlaw who causes most of the trouble for the good citizens of New Texas. Dangling from one bony hip is his dreaded weapon, the Hexmaker. Though it normally fires freeze rays, Tex Hex can also load it with the special hex loads carried in his bandolier. These have a number of magical properties, from explosions to shape changing. With them and his cunning criminal mind, he virtually rules the rampant outlaw elements of New Texas. Tex Hex has but one simple goal: to conquer the planet of New Texas and obtain its great wealth of Kerium for himself. And from that description we can see how it pertains to this specific illustration, especially with regards to the skeletal aspect of the character. As the design process continued, flesh was added to Tex Hex's face, albeit a dramatically weathered flesh. Another very early skeletal design also appears in one of the conceptual illustrations showing Tex Hex alongside a character who would become his favourite punching bag, the ever-smoking Scuzz. In these early stages, the villain was also to have a steed, no doubt called Nightmare, as numerous evil animated horses were during this decade. Here we see an earlier close-up of Tex Hex with, thankfully, a little more flesh on his face, but you'll see how the character evolves with the next illustration. This particular piece is closer to the final design with a far more streamlined presentation. Not to dismiss the previous illustration, but this design presents him more like a supervillain, for want of a better word. His costume has more personality now. In these illustrations depicting Tex Hex's head, you can see that they were still favouring the skull-like eyes. What is interesting to note in these pieces is Tex Hex's upturned nose, with his nostrils still representing a somewhat skeletal design, something that would be toned down in the final version. If we go back to the very first image I showcased, we can see here that the illustration has been updated to reflect the evolving design of the character. However, Tex Hex's steed was not long for this world. One of the most wonderful things about the premise of BraveStarr is its mixture of the Old West and science fiction, allowing the writers and designers to develop wonderful things. Here we see an example of just that, the Old West meeting a possible future, with Tex Hex's steed now closer to what both the show and toy line would name a Skull Walker. Amusingly, one of the promotional illustrations developed for the show by the artists at Filmation depicts Tex Hex attempting to control a Skullwalker that, Dushan rightly pointed out to me, has been sabotaged by the prairie people, those pesky little varmints. This particular character turnaround, much like the Tex Hex that appeared in the Skullwalker illustrations, bears a striking resemblance to his final design, with a few minor tweaks still remaining. This illustration of Tex Hex, seen in the BraveStarr series guide, depicts what is more than likely the first coloured suggestion for Tex Hex. We can see that the villain is still a way off from his final design, with the artist still not entirely sure what to do with his face, although it is lovely to see that at a very early stage of colouring, that wonderful purple skin contrasted against his flowing white hair. And now we crossfade to one of the promotional illustrations developed for the show. You'll see that the pose is exactly the same, and looking at this piece I almost feel that the artist was working with a previous design and changes were applied to this illustration, as Tex Hex's head and certain elements of his appearance appear to be illustrated on top of whatever may have been illustrated originally. Now, before we get to the final design, I'm going to go through a plethora of illustrations. A few years back, I acquired an incredibly rare piece of Filmation history, a one-of-a-kind 351-page bound booklet showing the development of the visuals and characters for the BraveStarr series. As stated by the document, this material is part of an ongoing project and should be treated as confidential. Please return this material to Filmation when you are finished. Thank you. But given that this booklet is 37 years old, Filmation no longer exists and no one is doing anything at all with the BraveStarr property, I think I'm okay to showcase this material. For now, let us focus on Tex Hex. Now, there's no real order to these illustrations for the most part, as this in-progress artwork booklet was merely for certain individuals to look at. Heck, even many of those within Filmation Studios never saw this. The artist was simply given free rein and were visually coming up with ideas of what Tex Hex could do, the situations he would be present in, and how his powers could manifest on screen. So what we'll do here is take a look at these illustrations and muse as to what the artist had in mind. I think you'll enjoy this. This illustration is quite the mood-driven piece, almost as if we're seeing Tex Hex through the burning haze of the desert or a heavy thunderstorm. Regardless, it's quite the striking image. Here we see Tex Hex surrounded by some evil faces, clearly a reference to the evil powers he possesses. A rather frightening illustration, possibly showing Tex Hex having the ability to duplicate himself or perform some sort of spirit transfer. Either way, I think you'll agree it's creepy. This piece could be depicting the point of view of a poor victim whom the evil outlaw is hypnotizing. I do love the energy of this piece, it's very striking. I almost feel like Tex Hex is entering some sort of trance with this piece. His eyes are almost going into the back of his head as if communicating with another plane of existence. When I first saw this illustration, I thought the whole was the artist depicting a source of power emanating from that area outward across Tex Hex's physical form. Upon closer inspection, I think that Tex Hex is magically opening a hole in his body and avoiding a bullet. This one kind of refers to what I said about the previous illustration. Here we see what I believe is the artist depicting a source of power emanating from Tex Hex. Duchamp muses that the villain may be teleporting, which is a pretty good theory in itself. With the sun behind him, this could just be a mood piece showing Tex Hex at dawn, or it could be showing him becoming one with the dusk or invisibility. Duchamp muses that he could be emerging from a mirage. This one is rather obvious, Tex Hex demonstrating an ability to stretch, extend his neck, possibly all of his limbs. But what is good about this piece is that it perfectly showcases how the artists were just sitting at their desks and coming up with idea upon idea for the villain. Some of these powers would make their way into the series, others would not. These next 4 illustrations appear to show Tex Hex transforming his body and traversing the land. In the series we would sometimes see the evil outlaw transform into a fireball. These seem to be concepts for that very idea. Let's be honest, villains of the 1980s often had rather outlandish ways of escaping a losing battle. At first glance, I would think that these next 5 images demonstrate an idea for Tex Hex to be able to transform his very physicality. However, the first one showing Tex Hex as a wall suggests to me that these pieces actually showcase his ability to appear within certain objects in order to communicate a message, which is pretty bloody cool. This image is just creepy as hell, showing the sinewy structure turning into the head of Tex Hex. Almost looks like something out of a David Cronenberg movie. Ugh. This fantastic illustration could show us one of 2 things. The first is that it could be showing us the evil which lies within Tex Hex, or that the villain is not all that he seems. Alternatively, this could be presenting to us the idea that Tex Hex has a master whose very being resides inside Tex Hex, and it could be an early take on the awesome Stampede. Whilst this piece may demonstrate Tex Hex's ability to start a campfire, methinks it actually shows him communicating with an evil spirit, or looking at the face in the fire, his master Stampede. Here we see something rather cool, Tex Hex performing a classic piece of lasso work. Upon inspection, as we see, there are some rather terrifying faces lurking within the lasso. I like to think that the faces are trapped souls that somehow the villain has enslaved. Now, I may be wrong, but it appears that Tex Hex is holding some sort of book and an evil spirit is looming over him. What do you think? This could be just another awesomely evil illustration of Tex Hex, or it could be another example of hypnosis. It would be good at this point to highlight one of my favourite decisions made by the character designers. In many of these illustrations, Tex Hex is depicted with black eyes with tiny white pupils, which we would assume are red. Thankfully, to make the character more menacing and emotive, the decision was made to give Tex Hex big red eyes with black pupils, which I think really adds to his menace, as his eyes are rather large and dominate much of his face. I'm not sure it would have worked the other way around. I don't know. As a side note, Skeletor, as seen in the New Adventures of He-Man, initially went from having black eyes with red pupils to having red eyes with black pupils. He also initially had white eyes with black pupils, but that's a video for another time. I originally believed this to be a rather striking illustration of Tex Hex appearing through the clouds or the winds of the desert to threaten one of the prairie people. Duchamp countered, correctly stating that Tex Hex is emerging from a lake, showcasing how intrusive the outlaw is to the daily lives of the prairie people. And here we see an illustration of Tex Hex's image appearing from within a campfire, lending great credence to Duchamp's theory. And speaking of the prairie people, let's talk about one of their own, the outlaw, Scuzz. These next 6 illustrations are both wonderful and hilarious in their depictions of Tex Hex losing his patience with Scuzz, something we would see in the series, though it's safe to say that Tex Hex never lost this much patience with poor old Scuzz. The energy in these illustrations is fantastic, and the last one is rather harsh because upon closer inspection, Tex Hex is hanging poor old Scuzz from the neck. Eek! Tex Hex here appears to be terrorising some people within a stagecoach, which is rather ideal for a space western. And here are three pretty lovely illustrations depicting Tex Hex in confrontation with BraveStarr. You can see in these pieces that the character is very close to what the final design would be. Actually, that applies to BraveStarr too, who himself in numerous early illustrations was depicted at times wearing a visor. And finally, a very cool illustration of Tex Hex menacingly appearing from around the corner, peering at a young lady. This piece actually reminds me of what we would see in the episode Eye of the Beholder, in which Tex Hex would meet a woman, Ali Kingston, who unearths some long since buried emotions in him. In the episode, Tex Hex speaks to Ali in seclusion, what with him being an outlaw and all. The final design of Tex Hex is wonderful. Not only does it perfectly capture all the ideas we have seen presented to us, but it really does showcase just how good Filmation's character design department had come. It's a shame that Tex Hex is not celebrated alongside the likes of Skeletor, Megatron, Mumra, because he really should be. Not to go into too much detail in this video, especially at this point as I wrap up here, but he has a fascinating backstory. His desire for Kerium, initially to better the lives of he and the love of his life Ursula, turned to greed and drove him to his own destruction, only for him to be almost cruelly resurrected in a fantastically animated sequence by one of Filmation's most incredible monsters, Stampede. And if you think that the dynamic is a simple master-servant situation, you are very much mistaken. Tex Hex is Stampede's slave, a puppet to do his bidding. We see moments in the series in which the character clearly wants to put this life of evil behind him, especially when we are introduced to the aforementioned Ali Kingston, but sadly for Tex Hex, a life of peace is no longer an option. And that's it for this very visual video. Thank you for watching. Please be sure to like, comment, share and subscribe, and I will catch you on the next one.